A man is certain his son died 3 years ago, but during a seemingly ordinary vacation, he accidentally meets a young man who looks just like him. Could this unexpected encounter be the miracle he's been desperately hoping for? Or is it a heartbreaking illusion born from his grief? As their paths intertwine, what secrets lie beneath their striking resemblance? Don't miss this emotional journey of loss, hope, and the quest for truth that will keep you captivated until the very end. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The evening shadows stretched across John Whitfield's living room, casting long fingers across the worn hardwood floor. Outside his modest Ohio farmhouse, crickets chirped their nightly chorus, but inside, the silence felt heavy and familiar. John sat in his old armchair, his weathered hands resting on the armrests as he stared at the framed photograph on the side table. The picture showed happier times. Him and Ethan at the lake, both sporting wide grins as they held up an impressive catch. Ethan's red baseball cap was slightly crooked, just the way he always wore it. John's throat tightened as he reached out to touch the glass, his finger tracing the outline of his son's face. The sharp ring of the telephone cut through the quiet, making John jump slightly. He hesitated before answering, recognizing the number on the caller ID. "Hello, Pastor Linda," he said softly. "John, I'm so glad I caught you." Pastor Linda Thompson's warm voice came through the line. "I wanted to talk to you about our upcoming church trip to Maine next week. We'd really love for you to join us." John's immediate instinct was to decline. "I appreciate the invitation, but I don't think—" "Sarah and Mike were just saying yesterday how much they miss seeing you," Pastor Linda continued gently. "And Betty mentioned that the coastal air might do you some good." John's eyes drifted back to the photograph. 3 years had passed since the accident, but sometimes it felt like yesterday. The church members had been there through it all, bringing meals, offering prayers, sitting with him during those first terrible weeks. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody's pushing you, John, but sometimes a change of scenery can help us see things differently, help us heal." After a long pause, John surprised himself by saying, "When do we leave?" The next morning found him packing a small duffel bag, his movements mechanical but purposeful. He tucked in a few essentials, clothes, toiletries, his worn Bible. After a moment's hesitation, he slipped the framed photo of him and Ethan into the bag as well. Before leaving, John stepped into his backyard. A small stone memorial sat beneath the old oak tree, a simple plaque with Ethan's name and dates surrounded by carefully tended flowers. John knelt beside it, his hand resting on the cool stone. "I'm trying, son," he whispered. "I'm trying to find my way back." The church bus waited at the end of his driveway, a handful of familiar faces visible through the windows. Pastor Linda stood by the door, offering a warm smile as John approached. He climbed aboard, settling into a seat by the window. As the bus pulled away, John watched his house disappear around the bend. His heart felt heavy, yet somehow different, as if a tiny crack had appeared in the wall he'd built around himself. Through the window, the morning sun painted the Ohio countryside in shades of gold, and for the first time in a long while, John felt something stir inside him that felt almost like hope. The bus rolled into the small Maine coastal station, its wheels crunching on the gravel as it came to a stop. John blinked against the bright afternoon sun, taking in the unfamiliar scene before him. Colorful storefronts lined the main street, their weathered signs swaying gently in the salt-tinged breeze. It was worlds away from his quiet Ohio farmhouse. "Welcome to Camden," Pastor Linda announced cheerfully as the group descended the bus steps. The air felt different here, crisp and clean with the tang of salt and seaweed. Fishermen in rubber boots walked past, nodding friendly hellos. Near the water's edge, children chased each other, their laughter carried on the breeze. John watched them for a moment, his chest tightening at the sound. The Seaside Inn stood just 2 blocks from the station, its white clapboard exterior freshly painted, blue shutters framing each window. Inside, the floors creaked pleasantly under their feet as they checked in. "Here's your key, John," Martha Wilson, another church member, said softly. "We're just down the hall if you need anything." His room was small but comfortable, with a narrow balcony overlooking the harbor. John set his duffel bag on the bed and began to unpack, his movements slow and methodical. The framed photograph of him and Ethan found its place on the bedside table. Through the thin walls, he could hear the excited chatter of his fellow church members discussing their plans. Pastor Linda's voice rose above the others, outlining their schedule: lighthouse tours, boat rides, group dinners at local restaurants. And of course, plenty of free time for everyone to explore on their own, she added. John stepped out onto his balcony, gripping the railing as he watched boats bob in the harbor below. The sea breeze ruffled his hair, carrying the calls of seagulls and the distant clang of buoy bells. It was peaceful here, in a way that felt both foreign and somehow right. Sarah, one of the older church members, knocked softly on his open door. "We're all heading down to the common room to plan tomorrow's activities. Would you like to join us?" John hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be down in a minute." When she left, he remained on the balcony for a moment longer. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, vast and mysterious. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, John felt something shift inside him. Not quite peace, but perhaps the first tentative step toward it. The sound of waves against the shore provided a steady rhythm as he stood there, both grounding him in the present moment and stirring memories of days spent by the lake with Ethan. The familiar ache of loss was still there, but somehow the fresh air and new surroundings made it feel a little less overwhelming. The first hints of dawn hadn't yet touched the horizon when John slipped out of the inn. Sleep had eluded him, leaving him restless in the unfamiliar room. The wooden steps of the inn's back porch creaked softly under his feet as he made his way toward the beach. The sand was cool beneath his shoes, still holding the chill from the night air. Waves lapped steadily at the shore, their rhythm matching his slow footsteps. In the pre-dawn darkness, the beach stretched out before him like a blank canvas, empty and waiting. John's mind drifted back to the nightmare he kept having, of something he'd imagined several times. A calm lake, deceptively peaceful. Ethan would be excited about an afternoon of fishing. They'd done it countless times before. It was their special thing, just father and son. However, Ethan went fishing alone. The memory came in waves, just like the water before him. The sudden storm, the capsized boat, the endless searching that followed, day after day, until hope had withered into grief. A seabird called overhead, pulling John back to the present. He realized he'd stopped walking, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. Forcing himself to move again, he continued along the shoreline. Other memories surfaced, happier ones that somehow hurt even more. Ethan running through sprinklers on hot summer days, his laughter echoing across their backyard, teaching him to throw a baseball, his small face scrunched in concentration. The proud grin when he finally got it right. The weight of loss pressed heavily on John's chest. He stopped again, breathing deeply of the ocean air, trying to steady himself. The darkness around him matched his mood, but something inside him refused to surrender completely to despair. "I have to keep going," he whispered to himself, the words nearly lost in the sound of the waves. John squared his shoulders and continued walking. Each step felt like an act of defiance against the grief that threatened to overwhelm him. The beach stretched endlessly ahead, and he walked on, one foot in front of the other as the sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly. When he finally paused again, the horizon had begun to show the first pale signs of dawn. He stood there, exhausted but somehow stronger, watching the gentle waves roll in. The familiar ache in his heart remained, but alongside it stirred something else, a quiet determination to face whatever lay ahead. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky as John made his way toward the old wooden pier. Salt-weathered planks stretched out over the water, their gray surfaces worn smooth by countless footsteps and years of sea spray. The familiar creak of wood under his feet brought back memories of similar mornings spent fishing with Ethan. That's when he saw him, a young man standing near the end of the pier, fishing rod held steady in his hands. John's steps faltered. The way the boy stood, slightly leaning forward with one foot casually crossed behind the other, was so achingly familiar it made his breath catch. The morning light caught the young man's profile as he adjusted his grip on the fishing rod. John's heart began to pound. That jawline, the slight tilt of his head, it was like looking at a ghost. The resemblance to Ethan was uncanny. down to the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. John's hands trembled as he gripped the pier's railing. Could his mind be playing tricks on him? He'd seen glimpses of Ethan before, in crowds, on streets, in stores, only to have his hopes dashed when he looked closer. But this felt different. Moving carefully, trying not to disturb the quiet morning, John edged closer. The young man remained focused on his fishing, unaware of John's presence. A small smile played across the boy's face as he adjusted his line, and John's heart nearly stopped. It was Ethan's smile, the same slight curve of lips, the same hint of dimple in his right cheek. Memories crashed over John like waves. Ethan at 14, standing proudly with his first catch, teaching him to tie fishing knots, those same careful hands working the line. The last morning they'd spent together, Ethan's excited voice calling him to see the sunrise over the lake. John's mind raced with questions. It couldn't be possible, could it? Ethan had been lost in the accident. They'd searched for weeks, but here was this young man, every movement, every feature a mirror of his son, his heart pounding so hard he could barely breathe. John took another step forward. He had to know, had to see if this impossible hope could be real. His foot landed on a loose board, causing a loud creak. The young man turned slightly at the sound, and John caught a clearer view of his face. The resemblance was even more striking up close. Those same deep brown eyes, the same slight arch of eyebrows. John's vision blurred with tears as he gathered his courage to speak. John's heart thundered in his chest as he watched Eli methodically checking his fishing line. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of the pier, and a cool breeze carried the tang of salt air around them. Taking a deep breath, John steadied himself against the railing. "Excuse me?" he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but you look so much like someone I know." Eli's shoulders tensed. He kept his focus on his fishing rod, but his movements became more deliberate, mechanical. "My son," John continued, taking a careful step forward. "You look exactly like my son, Ethan. The way you fish, even how you're standing right now. It's just like him." At the mention of the name, Eli's hands froze on the fishing line. He turned slightly, meeting John's gaze for just a moment before quickly looking away. The flash of recognition in the boy's eyes made John's breath catch. "I remember teaching him to fish when he was 12, John pressed on, his voice thick with emotion. "He always crossed his feet the same way you do, always held the rod at that exact angle." Eli began hurriedly reeling in his line, his movements sharp and anxious. "I'm sorry," he muttered, barely loud enough to hear over the lapping waves. "You've got the wrong person." "Please," John said, taking another step closer. "If there's any chance, if you remember anything." But Eli was already gathering his tackle box, his movements quick and jerky. He kept his head down, avoiding John's pleading gaze as he stuffed his gear into a worn canvas bag. "I need to go," Eli said abruptly, slinging the bag over his shoulder. "I'm sorry, but I'm not who you think I am." Before John could say another word, Eli turned and strode quickly down the pier, his footsteps echoing on the wooden planks. John watched helplessly as the young man's figure grew smaller, disappearing among the morning crowd near the shoreline. The sudden silence felt deafening. John stood rooted to the spot, his hands gripping the pier's railing so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His chest ached with a familiar hollow feeling, but something else burned beneath the pain, a certainty he couldn't shake. Those eyes, that brief moment of connection, it had felt real, too real to ignore. John pushed open the weathered door of the bait shop, triggering a small bell that announced his arrival. The cramped space smelled of salt and fish, with wooden shelves lined with colorful lures, hooks, and various fishing supplies. Several locals milled about, examining gear and chatting in low voices. His eyes adjusted to the dimmer light inside as he scanned the shop, looking past the tanks of live bait bubbling quietly in the corner. A movement at the back of the store caught his attention, someone sorting through boxes of fishing line. "Help you find something?" The gruff voice belonged to an older man behind the counter. His weathered face and calloused hands spoke of decades spent on the water. A name tag identified him as Sal. "Yes, John hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I was down at the pier earlier today and noticed a young man fishing. Looked to be in his early 20s. Old Sal's expression hardened slightly. "That'd be Eli. He helps out around here sometimes." "Eli," John repeated softly. "Does he come by the shop often?" "Often enough." Old Sal's tone grew more guarded as he began arranging items on the counter. "You're looking to buy something, or just asking questions?" "I was hoping to learn a bit more about him," John pressed gently. "How long has he lived in town?" Old Sal's movements became more deliberate, his jaw tightening. "Listen, mister, Eli's business is his own. We don't go spreading stories about folks around here." "I understand, but—" "Shop's closing up soon," Old Sal cut him off, gesturing toward the door. "Anything else you need? Bait? Tackle?" John recognized the dismissal in Old Sal's tone. "No, thank you. I appreciate your time." The bell chimed again as John stepped out into the evening air. He stood on the sidewalk, watching as the setting sun painted long shadows across the storefront. Old Sal's protective attitude and abrupt responses only deepened his curiosity about Eli. There was something more here, something the old shopkeeper clearly didn't want to discuss. The early morning sun cast long rays through the bait shop's dusty windows, creating golden stripes across the wooden floor. Eli moved methodically between the shelves, his fingers trailing along rows of fishing lures as he arranged them by size and color. The quiet morning air held only the soft hum of the bait tanks and the occasional creak of old floorboards beneath his feet. John pushed the door open slowly, causing the bell to chime softly. Eli glanced up briefly before returning to his task, his shoulders tensing slightly at the early customer's arrival. "Morning," John said, keeping his voice gentle and casual. "You're here early." "Shop opens in an hour," Eli replied, continuing to sort through a box of fishing weights. "Just getting things ready." John picked up a fishing lure, examining it carefully. "This is a good one for bass. Used to fish with these all the time back home in Ohio." Eli nodded politely but said nothing. "The fishing must be pretty good around here," John continued, moving closer to where Eli worked. "Any favorite spots you'd recommend?" "The pier's decent," Eli answered, reaching up to adjust some items on a higher shelf. As he stretched, his t-shirt shifted slightly, revealing a small, distinctive mark on his left shoulder, a scarred birthmark in the shape of a rough crescent. John's breath caught in his throat. The birthmark was identical to Ethan's, down to the smallest detail. His hands began to tremble as memories flooded back, of bandaging scraped knees, of swimming lessons, of that small mark he'd known since the day his son was born. "That birthmark," John said softly, his voice wavering, "on your shoulder." Eli quickly adjusted his shirt, covering the mark. His expression remained neutral, but his movements became more hurried. "Just an old scar," he muttered, moving behind the counter to create distance between them. "It's very distinctive," John pressed gently. "I've only ever seen one exactly like it." "Lots of people have birthmarks," Eli cut in, his voice tight. He began arranging items in the display case with sharp, anxious movements. "Is there something specific you needed from the shop today?" John stood there, his heart pounding. The mark was unmistakable. The same shape, the same location. It had to mean something. But Eli's blank expression and defensive posture made it clear that pushing further would only cause him to retreat more. The mid-morning sun streamed through the bait shop windows as John lingered near the counter, his eyes fixed on the spot where Eli had been working earlier. A few customers milled about, examining fishing gear and chatting about the day's weather conditions. The bell above the door chimed as Old Sal entered, his weathered face darkening when he spotted John. Old Sal moved purposefully through the shop, nodding briefly to the other customers before positioning himself directly in front of John. His stance was rigid, his expression stern. "We need to talk," Old Sal said, his voice low but firm. "Step outside." Once they were on the wooden porch of the shop, Old Sal crossed his arms and fixed John with a hard stare. "I know what you're thinking, and you need to stop." "I just want to understand," John began, but Old Sal cut him off. "Listen carefully." Old Sal's voice grew rougher. "That boy nearly drowned 3 years ago. Lost most of his memories. The doctors said pushing too hard could harm him. You coming around, asking questions? It's not good for him. John's hands clenched at his sides. You don't understand. The birthmark, his mannerisms. I understand plenty, old Sal interrupted, and I'm telling you to leave it alone. Stop pestering him. I can't do that. John's voice cracked with emotion. If there's even a chance he's my son. Your son. Old Sal's eyes narrowed. Or someone you want to be your son. Either way, you're going to cause damage you can't undo. The tension between them crackled like static before a storm. Other customers passed by, giving them a wide berth. I need to know the truth, John insisted, standing his ground. I have a right to know. Old Sal leaned closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You have no rights here. That boy is under my care and I'm warning you. Don't go stirring up memories best left buried. John stared back at old Sal, his jaw set firmly despite the older man's threatening tone. The morning breeze carried the salt air around them, but neither man moved, locked in their standoff. Finally, John turned away, his steps heavy as he descended the shop's wooden steps. The town bustled around him, oblivious to the weight pressing down on his shoulders. Old Sal's warning echoed in his mind, but it only strengthened his resolve to uncover the truth about Eli. In the softly lit common area of the inn, John sat alone in a plush armchair, his hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea. The evening had settled in, casting long shadows across the room's wooden floors and comfortable furnishings. The gentle ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner marked time as he wrestled with his thoughts. Images of Eli's birthmark flashed through his mind, identical to the one Ethan had carried since birth. The coincidence was too strong to ignore. John set his cup down on the side table with trembling hands. I can't leave now, he whispered to himself. Not when I'm this close. Rising from his chair, John walked to the front desk and arranged to extend his stay for another week. The decision lightened something in his chest, even as his wallet grew lighter. With renewed purpose, he sought out Pastor Linda, finding her in the small library adjacent to the common area. Pastor Linda, do you have a moment? John asked, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. She looked up from her book, concern crossing her face as she noted his serious expression. Of course, John. What's on your mind? I've decided to stay in Maine after the group leaves, he said, settling into a nearby chair. I need to understand what's happening here with Eli. That birthmark, it's exactly like Ethan's. Pastor Linda leaned forward, her eyes gentle but worried. John, are you sure this is wise? Sometimes our grief can make us see things we want to see. I know how it sounds, John admitted, but I have to know the truth. Word spread quickly through the small church group. Soon, several members gathered in the common area, their faces showing a mix of concern and support. Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman with silver hair, touched John's arm gently. We just don't want to see you hurt again, dear, she said softly. I appreciate everyone's concern, John addressed the group, but I need to do this. Whether I find answers or not, I'll never forgive myself if I don't try. Pastor Linda stood before the group. Then we'll pray for you, John, for wisdom, strength, and peace, whatever the outcome. The group formed a circle, joining hands in prayer. John felt their support wash over him, strengthening his resolve. As the impromptu meeting dispersed, various members approached him individually, some offering words of caution, others expressing their hopes for his search. Later, John walked through the inn's quiet corridors, passing by other guests engaged in their evening routines. He paused by a window, gazing out at the star-filled Maine sky. The weight of his decision settled around his shoulders, but for the first time since arriving, he felt truly certain of his path. The morning sun streamed through the library's tall windows, casting warm patches of light across the polished wooden tables and well-organized shelves. Martha, the town librarian, moved with practiced efficiency between the reference section and her desk, her silver-rimmed glasses catching the light as she worked. John entered the library, the soft creak of the old door announcing his presence. The familiar scent of aged paper and wood polish reminded him of peaceful afternoons spent reading with Ethan. His footsteps echoed softly on the hardwood floor as he approached the main desk. Martha looked up, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners as she smiled. "Good morning. Can I help you find something?" "I hope so," John said, his voice quiet in the library's stillness. "I'm looking for information about incidents from about 3 years ago, specifically any records about near drownings or missing persons." Martha's expression softened with interest. She gestured to a nearby chair, inviting John to sit. "That's quite specific. Would you like to tell me more about what you're looking for?" John settled into the chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. As he shared his story about Ethan, the birthmark, and his encounter with Eli, Martha listened intently, nodding occasionally and jotting down notes on a small pad. "I know it might sound impossible," John concluded, "but I need to know the truth." Martha removed her glasses, cleaning them thoughtfully with the edge of her cardigan. "In my 30 years as town librarian, I've learned that very few things are truly impossible. We keep extensive records here, newspapers, hospital reports, even personal accounts from townspeople." "Would you help me look through them?" John asked, hope rising in his chest. "Of course," Martha replied, already rising from her chair. "We can start with the local newspapers from that period. Then there are the hospital records. They're not as detailed as medical files, but they note major incidents. We also have several journals donated by longtime residents. Together, they mapped out a research plan on a sheet of paper. Martha's neat handwriting listed potential sources and areas to investigate, creating a systematic approach to their search. "We'll need to be thorough," Martha explained, tapping her pen against the paper. "Sometimes the smallest detail can lead to the biggest discoveries." John felt the weight on his shoulders lighten slightly. In Martha's calm efficiency and genuine desire to help, he found an unexpected ally. The morning light continued to fill the library as they discussed their approach, marking the beginning of their partnership in uncovering the truth about Eli. The archival room's fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as John and Martha settled at the large wooden table. Cardboard boxes filled with yellowed papers and manila folders surrounded them, each carefully labeled with dates and categories. The musty scent of old paper filled the air. "Let's start with the newspapers," Martha suggested, pulling out a thick stack of local papers from 3 years ago. "We'll focus on the summer months first, around the time of Ethan's accident." John nodded, carefully unfolding the delicate pages. His fingers traced over headlines and columns, scanning for any mention of drownings or rescues. Martha worked methodically beside him, making notes on a legal pad whenever something caught her attention. After an hour of searching, John's eyes burned from strain. "Nothing here matches the exact date," he said, rubbing his temples. "Let's try the hospital records," Martha suggested, reaching for a box labeled Emergency Admissions 2020-2021. Sometimes these contain details the papers missed. They pored over admission forms and incident reports, many handwritten and difficult to read. John's heart jumped whenever he spotted entries about water-related accidents, but none seemed to match Eli's case exactly. "This is harder than I thought it would be," John admitted, setting down another inconclusive report. "So many gaps in the information." Martha adjusted her glasses. "Small towns aren't always the best at keeping complete records, but sometimes—" She pulled out a thin folder of missing person bulletins. "These might tell us something." They cross-referenced names and dates, creating a timeline on a separate sheet of paper. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. Reports of a disoriented teenage boy found near the shore, mentions of memory loss, brief notes about a local fisherman taking in a young stranger. "Look at this," Martha said, pointing to a small notation in the corner of a police report. "There's a mention of a John Doe case from that summer. The description matches Eli's general appearance." John leaned forward eagerly, but his excitement faded as he realized the report contained no follow-up information. His shoulders slumped slightly. "Don't lose heart," Martha said, patting his hand. "These things take time. Records in small towns are like puzzle pieces, scattered but connected. We just need to keep looking." They continued their search until the afternoon light began to fade through the high windows. Though exhausted, John felt grateful for Martha's steady presence and unwavering support. As they organized their notes and prepared to leave, they shared a look of quiet determination, knowing tomorrow would bring another day of searching through the town's paper trail for answers. The evening shadows lengthened across the library's donated books section as Martha methodically sorted through cardboard boxes. Dust motes danced in the fading light that filtered through the high windows, creating ethereal patterns in the quiet space. Her fingers moved carefully over worn book spines and loose papers, checking each item thoroughly, her practiced movements reflecting years of library experience. "There's so much here," Martha murmured, lifting another weathered volume from a box marked "Hospital Donations." The musty scent of old paper filled her nostrils as she worked. As she shifted the book, something slipped from between its pages. A small leather-bound journal with fraying edges and coffee-stained corners. "No!" Martha's breath caught as she opened the journal's delicate cover, her heart quickening at the discovery. The handwriting inside was neat but hurried, typical of a medical professional's quick notes, written in faded blue ink that had stood the test of time. Her eyes widened as she began to read, her fingers trembling slightly against the yellowed pages. "John," she called softly, her voice trembling with excitement. "I think you need to see this." The urgency in her tone carried across the quiet room. John moved quickly to her side, pulling up a wooden chair that creaked under his weight. Martha pointed to an entry dated exactly 3 years ago, her finger resting beneath the crucial words. "Listen to this," she said, reading aloud. "Admitted unconscious teen today. No identification. Found near shore by local fishermen. During night shift, patient mumbled, 'Mom, Dad,' repeatedly in sleep. No visible trauma except minor cuts and bruises, showing signs of water inhalation." Her voice grew stronger with each word, the significance of the entry becoming clearer. John's hands shook as he took the journal from Martha, his fingers gentle despite his eagerness. His eyes scanned the words repeatedly, drinking in every detail, searching for any connection to his son. "The date," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "It's the exact day Ethan disappeared." Martha watched as John's fingers traced the written words, his eyes filling with tears that threatened to spill onto the fragile pages. The journal's pages crinkled softly under his touch as he turned to the next entry, then the next, searching for more information with desperate hope. "This could be it," Martha said gently, placing her warm hand on John's shoulder in a gesture of support. "This could be the proof we've been looking for." Her words hung in the air between them, full of possibility. John clutched the journal to his chest, his emotions overwhelming him as the reality of their discovery sank in. The library's silence enveloped them as they sat together, the weight of their discovery hanging in the air like a physical presence. Martha reached for her notepad, her practical nature already planning their next steps, while John remained still, holding the journal like a precious treasure that might dissolve if handled too roughly. The evening light had almost completely faded now, casting long shadows across the scattered books and papers surrounding them. The last rays of sunlight painted golden streaks across the floor, and the air grew still and heavy. In the dimness, John and Martha shared a look of profound understanding. They had finally found something real, something tangible that connected Ethan's disappearance to the mysterious boy who now called himself Eli. The piece of evidence they'd been searching for had been waiting here all along, hidden between the pages of an old book, like a message in a bottle washing up on shore. The library's reading room was silent except for the gentle hum of fluorescent lights overhead. John sat at a massive wooden table, his shoulders hunched as he pored over the open journal before him. The single desk lamp cast a warm glow across the weathered pages, highlighting the hurried handwriting of the hospital staff member. Martha remained beside him, her face etched with concern and unwavering support. As John read through the entries, his hands trembled. The words painted vivid pictures in his mind. Ethan, alone and struggling in the dark waters, desperately calling out for his parents. The memory of that terrible day crashed over him like a wave. "Listen to this part," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "Patient extremely agitated during fever spike. Keeps reaching out, calling for father. Mentioned fishing trip and promises to be careful. He pressed his palm against the page. That was our last conversation, Martha. I made him promise to be careful on the water. Martha placed a gentle hand on his arm as John continued reading, his eyes scanning each word with intense focus. The journal entries described a young boy, confused and afraid, clinging to memories of his family even in his unconscious state. Ethan and I were always close, John shared, looking up from the journal. Every summer morning we'd go fishing together, just the two of us. He'd tell me about school, his dreams. His voice cracked. Even when he was sick or scared, he'd always look for me first. Martha nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. These entries show that connection remained, John. Even in his worst moments, he was reaching for you. John's fingers traced the written words describing his son's desperate calls for his parents. Each entry strengthened his conviction. The mysterious patient had to be Ethan. The detailed descriptions of the boy's behavior, his mumbled words about fishing and family, aligned too perfectly with his son's characteristics to be mere coincidence. I can't ignore this, Martha, John said, his voice growing stronger despite the pain evident in his expression. These entries, they're proof that Ethan survived, that he was here calling for me, while I was miles away believing he was gone. Martha leaned forward, her face determined. We'll keep searching, John. There must be more records, more people who remember what happened. The night deepened around them as John carefully closed the journal, holding it like a precious artifact. He met Martha's steady gaze, his eyes reflecting both the weight of his grief and the spark of renewed hope. Together, they silently acknowledged their shared commitment to uncovering the complete truth about what happened 3 years ago. The first rays of sunlight crept through the small window of Eli's apartment above the bait shop. The modest room held just the essentials, a narrow bed, a weathered dresser, and a few fishing implements hanging on the walls. Eli stirred in his sleep, his face twitching as fragmented images flickered through his mind. He woke with a start, his heart racing. The dreams had felt so real, a warm hand on his shoulder, the sound of gentle laughter, and the distinct smell of fresh-caught fish being cooked. These weren't just random dreams. They felt like memories trying to surface. Sitting up in bed, Eli pressed his palms against his temples. The faces in his dreams remained frustratingly blurry, but the emotions they stirred were crystal clear. A sense of belonging, of safety, of family. Feelings that had been absent since his accident 3 years ago. Old Sal had told him about the day they found him, half drowned and with no memory of who he was. But these new fragments felt different, more substantial than the usual confused thoughts that sometimes plagued him. Without fully understanding why, Eli knew he needed to find John. Something about the man's presence made these memories feel closer, more accessible. He quickly dressed and headed downstairs, his footsteps echoing in the quiet morning air. He found John walking along the shore just as the sun cleared the horizon. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he approached. "Mr. Whitfield?" His voice came out softer than intended. John turned, surprise and hope flickering across his face. "Eli? I've been seeing things in my dreams." Eli shifted uncomfortably, struggling to find the right words. "Faces I can't quite make out, but they feel important." John's breath caught in his throat. "Do any of these feel familiar?" he asked carefully, his voice barely above a whisper. Eli wrapped his arms around himself as if trying to hold the fragments of memory together. "When you're around, something feels right, like I should know you, but it's all mixed up in my head." He looked up at John, his eyes reflecting confusion and longing. "I don't understand why, but being near you feels safe, like coming home." John stood perfectly still, afraid that any sudden movement might break this delicate moment. They faced each other in the growing morning light, two souls connected by an invisible thread neither could fully grasp. The silence between them held both promise and uncertainty, filled with unspoken questions and half-remembered truths. As Eli turned to leave, the brightening sunlight illuminated his features, and for a moment, John saw his son's face superimposed over Eli's retreating form. The bait shop buzzed with activity as customers streamed in and out, their voices mixing with the rhythmic sound of the nearby waves and the occasional cry of seabirds overhead. Old Sal stood behind the counter, his weathered hands gripping the edge until his knuckles whitened as he watched Eli assist customers with bait selections and fishing advice. His eyes repeatedly darted to John, who lingered near the tackle display, pretending to examine fishing lures while secretly studying Eli's every movement and mannerism. The morning rush began to thin like fog burning off the harbor, and Old Sal's patience wore equally thin. He emerged from behind the counter, his boots heavy against the wooden floor as he approached John, the floorboards creaking beneath his determined stride. "We need to talk," he growled, gesturing toward the shop's entrance with a sharp jerk of his head. Outside, Old Sal's face hardened like sun-baked clay as he confronted John. "This stops now. Your presence here is disturbing Eli and my business." His voice carried a threatening edge that made several passers-by turn their heads and quicken their steps. "I have a right to know if he's my son," John replied firmly, standing his ground despite the older man's intimidating presence. His hands clenched at his sides, steadying his resolve. Old Sal's face reddened like a storm-warning sky. "From now on, Eli doesn't leave this shop without supervision. I won't have you filling his head with false hopes and confused memories." He jabbed a finger at John's chest, the gesture sharp and aggressive. "And I've already spoken to Sheriff Matthews about your harassment. He's keeping an eye on the situation." The news of Old Sal's report to the authorities spread through the small town like wind through fishing nets. At the local diner, patrons whispered their opinions over coffee cups and half-eaten plates of eggs. Some nodded in agreement with Old Sal's protective stance, while others expressed sympathy for John's desperate search for his son. The town divided like a tide pulling in two directions. "That poor man just wants to know if it's his boy," Martha from the library was overheard saying to a group of regular customers, her voice soft with compassion. "Anyone would do the same in his shoes." "Old Sal's just protecting what's his," counter-argued Tom from the hardware store, tapping his coffee spoon for emphasis. "Can't have strangers stirring up trouble in our quiet town. Besides, the boy seems happy enough here." Behind his gruff exterior, Old Sal's hands trembled slightly as he returned to his post behind the counter, the morning's confrontation leaving him more shaken than he cared to admit. Every time he looked at Eli, the weight of his secret pressed harder against his conscience like an anchor dragging along the seafloor. The memory of that stormy day 3 years ago haunted him. The desperate choice he'd made, the guilt he carried like a heavy net that never emptied. He watched Eli stack boxes of fishing line with careful precision, knowing that every day John remained in town brought them closer to a truth he couldn't face, like a storm on the horizon that couldn't be outrun. John left the bait shop with heavy steps, feeling the suspicious glances of townspeople following him down the street like shadows at sunset. The weight of Old Sal's threats and the community's growing hostility pressed down on his shoulders, but his determination remained unshaken, fortified by the certainty that somewhere in this coastal town, his son was alive and within reach. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town's central square as John carefully made his way through the bustling crowd. He kept his distance from the bait shop and docks, acutely aware of the sideways glances and whispered conversations that followed him. Some townspeople deliberately crossed the street to avoid him, while others offered sympathetic nods. Martha stood outside the library watching the scene unfold. When she overheard Mrs. Peterson from the bakery expressing concerns about John's presence in town, she stepped forward. "You don't understand," Martha said firmly but kindly. "John lost his son 3 years ago. He's not here to cause trouble. He's searching for answers about a child he loves deeply." Her words caught the attention of several passers-by, who gathered to listen. Martha continued, her voice steady and compassionate. "I've seen the evidence myself. There are too many coincidences to ignore. That birthmark, the timing of Eli's arrival, the journal entries we found, they all point to something that deserves to be investigated, not dismissed." Meanwhile, Eli managed to slip away from the bait shop briefly during his lunch break. He found John sitting on a bench near the town gazebo. "I keep having these dreams," Eli said quietly, his eyes fixed on the ground. "There's this fishing trip. I'm in a small boat with someone. He's teaching me how to cast a line properly." He looked up at John uncertainly. The man's face is blurry, but his voice, it feels familiar. John's heart raced at these words, but he remained still, letting Eli speak without interruption. The moment felt delicate, like a soap bubble that might burst at the slightest disturbance. The townsfolk watched these interactions from afar, their opinions divided. Tom from the hardware store shook his head disapprovingly, while Sarah from the diner defended John to her customers, pointing out how gentle and respectful his behavior had been. The strain of the situation showed clearly on all involved. Old Sal paced behind his counter, his movements agitated, and his expression dark. John's shoulders sagged under the weight of the community's scrutiny, while Eli appeared increasingly torn between his current life and the possibility of a different past. As evening approached, John stood alone in the square. The day's activities wound down around him, shop owners turning their signs to closed, and residents heading home for dinner. He watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, feeling both the heavy burden of the town's division and the tender hope sparked by Eli's shared memory. The afternoon sun warmed the sandy beach as John and Eli walked along the shoreline. Children's laughter and the gentle rhythm of waves created a soothing backdrop to their conversation. Eli pointed out his favorite fishing spots, describing the best times to catch specific types of fish, while John listened intently, noting how similar Eli's observations were to Ethan's old fishing wisdom. "The stripers usually come in closer during the incoming tide," Eli explained, his eyes brightening as he spoke. "Especially near those rocks over there." John nodded, remembering countless similar conversations with Ethan. Before he could respond, a commotion ahead caught their attention. A dolphin thrashed in the shallow water, clearly struggling to return to deeper waters. Without exchanging words, both men sprinted toward the distressed animal. John's mind flashed back to a similar rescue he and Ethan had performed years ago. "We need to stay calm," he called out to Eli. "Let's guide it gently." Eli was already knee-deep in the water, his movements careful but confident. "I'll try to direct its head toward the ocean," he said, positioning himself exactly as John would have instructed. Together, they worked in perfect synchronization. John provided steady guidance from one side, while Eli maneuvered through the water with natural grace, helping the dolphin find its bearings. Their teamwork drew a small crowd of onlookers who watched in fascination. "That's it," John encouraged, his voice catching as he witnessed Eli's intuitive understanding of how to handle the situation. "Just like that. Keep its blowhole above water." The dolphin responded to their gentle guidance, gradually making its way back to deeper waters. Several people on the beach pulled out their phones to record the rescue, murmuring words of admiration and support. As the dolphin finally swam free, Eli turned to John, water dripping from his clothes. Their eyes met, and tears welled up in Eli's eyes. Something profound passed between them, an unspoken connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. They stood there breathing heavily from the exertion, while the gathered crowd began to disperse. The rescued dolphin's fin appeared briefly in the distance, a final farewell before disappearing into the deeper waters. John's heart swelled with certainty as he watched Eli's face. The same compassion, the same instinctive response to help, the same natural ability in the water. It was all pure Ethan. Eli met his gaze, his eyes filled with tears and confusion, clearly affected by the powerful moment they'd just shared but uncertain why it felt so significant. The setting sun cast long shadows across the beach as John and Eli stood in silence, their clothes still dripping from the dolphin rescue. The peaceful sounds of waves lapping at the shore contrasted with the intense emotions coursing through them both. A gentle breeze carried the salty air around them as they processed the profound moment they'd just shared. Suddenly, Eli's eyes glazed over. The beach before him began to blur and shift, replaced by vivid images flooding his mind. He saw himself on a boat, younger and full of energy, working alongside John. The memory was crystal clear. They were pulling a struggling seal from tangled fishing nets, John's proud voice guiding him through the process. "Careful now, Ethan," John's voice echoed in his mind. "That's it, son. You're doing great." More memories cascaded through his consciousness. Lazy Sunday afternoons spent fixing fishing gear, John teaching him how to tie complex knots, the warm embrace of his father after a successful rescue. Each image brought with it a rush of emotions: love, security, belonging. Eli's legs weakened as the weight of recognition hit him. He stumbled slightly, and John instinctively reached out to steady him. The physical contact triggered even more memories, countless moments of his father's protective touch, gentle guidance, and unwavering support. Tears streamed down Eli's face as the fog of confusion finally lifted. His whole body trembled as he looked up at John, really seeing him for the first time since their reunion. "Dad?" he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. John's eyes widened in disbelief, hope and joy washing over his features. Without hesitation, he pulled Eli into a tight embrace, both men crying openly as years of separation melted away in an instant. "Ethan," John sobbed, holding his son close. "My boy." The few remaining beachgoers stopped to witness the powerful scene unfolding before them. Some wiped away tears of their own, touched by the palpable emotion of the father-son reunion. The moment seemed to radiate pure love and joy, affecting everyone within sight. As they held each other, Eli's memories continued to solidify. The accident, the struggle in the water, the darkness that had separated him from his past. But now, in his father's arms, he felt complete again. The missing pieces of his identity clicked into place, and he knew without doubt who he was. Ethan, John Whitfield's son. They finally pulled apart just enough to look at each other, tears still flowing freely. Their eyes met with newfound recognition, both men overwhelmed by the miracle of their reunion. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, as if nature itself was celebrating their reconciliation. The news of John and Eli's reunion spread through the seaside town like wildfire. As the evening settled in, groups of townspeople made their way to the main beach, drawn by the extraordinary story of a father finding his long-lost son. The golden light of sunset painted the scene as people gathered in clusters, their excited chatter filling the air. Pastor Linda led the church group onto the beach, carrying blankets and thermoses of hot coffee. She organized an impromptu circle of prayer, her voice carrying across the sand as she offered words of gratitude and blessing. The church members joined hands, forming a protective circle around John and Eli, their voices rising in harmony. "We thank you, Lord, for bringing this father and son back together." Pastor Linda's voice rang clear and strong. "We welcome Eli home with open hearts." Martha stood nearby, her eyes glistening with happy tears as she watched the scene unfold. Her countless hours in the library, poring over old records and journals, had helped piece together the puzzle that led to this moment. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing she had played a part in this miracle. Townspeople approached John and Eli with warm embraces and words of welcome. Some brought food from their homes, setting up an impromptu picnic on the beach. Children played nearby, their laughter adding to the festive atmosphere. The sense of community was palpable as people shared in the joy of the reunion. John stood in amazement, one arm wrapped around Eli's shoulders. The weight of grief that had burdened him for so long seemed to lift with each passing moment. He watched in wonder as the town celebrated their reunion, the collective joy reinforcing the miracle of finding his son. At the edge of the gathering, Old Sal leaned against a weathered post, his face troubled despite the joyous atmosphere. He remained apart from the celebration, his eyes fixed on Eli with an unreadable expression. While others rejoiced, he stood silent and withdrawn, the inner turmoil evident in his rigid posture. As night descended, lanterns and flashlights illuminated the beach. The celebration continued under the stars, with John and Eli at its heart, surrounded by their newfound community. The sound of gentle waves provided a peaceful backdrop to the conversations and laughter that filled the evening air. The beach glowed with lantern light as the celebration continued into the evening. Laughter and conversation filled the air while John and Eli sat together on a weathered bench, surrounded by well-wishers. The church group had set up tables with coffee and snacks, creating a warm atmosphere of community support. Suddenly, a hush fell over the gathering. Old Sal emerged from the shadows, clutching a manila folder in his weathered hands. His face was set in grim determination as he walked purposefully toward the center of the crowd. The festivities ground to a halt, all eyes turning to watch his approach. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Old Sal's gruff voice carried across the beach, "but there's something everyone needs to see." He pulled out several official-looking documents from the folder, holding them up for all to see. "These are legal papers declaring Ethan Whitfield deceased after the boating accident 3 years ago." Gasps rippled through the crowd. John's face drained of color as he stared at the papers, their official stamps clearly visible in the lantern light. "You can't just undo a death certificate," Old Sal continued, his voice firm. "The law doesn't work that way. This reunion, it's not possible." 2 police officers approached from the parking lot, summoned by Old Sal's earlier call. They began examining the documents, conferring in low voices about the legal implications. The crowd's mood shifted palpably. Whispers of doubt spread through the gathering. Some people stepped back, uncertain how to react to this new development. Others openly questioned whether they had been too quick to celebrate. John sat frozen, his hand falling away from Eli's shoulder. The weight of the legal declaration seemed to crush the air from his lungs. He watched helplessly as the officers nodded gravely over the papers, confirming their authenticity. Eli stood slightly apart, his eyes darting between John and Old Sal. His earlier joy had been replaced by confusion and distress. The memories that had felt so clear just hours ago now seemed to blur at the edges, leaving him uncertain of everything. The once jubilant crowd began to thin, people drifting away in small groups, their excited chatter replaced by worried murmurs. The remaining church members huddled together, their faces reflecting concern and disappointment. John remained rooted to the spot, watching as his newfound happiness crumbled under the weight of official documentation. The police officers continued their discussion with Old Sal, their serious expressions offering no hope for an easy resolution. Eli stood at the edge of the gathering, torn between approaching John and retreating with Old Sal. The lantern light cast long shadows across his troubled face as he witnessed the celebration dissolve into uncertainty and doubt. The municipal building's fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as John sat across from Officer Karen Mitchell. The worn wooden table between them held a scattered array of documents, newspaper clippings, the journal entry Martha had discovered, and various official papers. Through the large window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the simple office space. Officer Mitchell adjusted her reading glasses and picked up her notepad. "Mr. Whitfield, please walk me through the events of that day, the day of the boating accident." John's voice remained steady as he recounted the details. "It was July 15th, 3 years ago. Ethan was out on Lake Erie. The storm came up suddenly." His hands trembled slightly as he described the waves that had separated him from his son. The officer made careful notes, occasionally glancing at Eli, who sat quietly in a corner chair, his shoulders tense. "And you're certain about the birthmark? The same location? Same shape?" "Yes," John replied firmly, pulling out the hospital records Martha had uncovered. "And there's more. This journal entry from a nurse describes a boy brought in that same day, matching Ethan's description exactly." Officer Mitchell's expression remained neutral as she examined the documents. "Mr. Whitfield, grief can play tricks on our minds. We have official death certificates, proper documentation." "With all due respect," John interrupted, his voice thick with emotion, "documents can be wrong. The connection between Eli and me, it goes beyond paperwork. The way he handles himself on the water, his instincts during the dolphin rescue." "I understand your conviction," Officer Mitchell said, her tone softening slightly. "But we need to consider Eli's well-being. This situation could be extremely destabilizing for him." From his position outside the office door's window, Old Sal watched the proceedings, his weathered face tight with anxiety. His fingers drummed nervously against his leg as he observed the interaction. "I need you to understand," Officer Mitchell continued, shuffling the papers into a neat stack, "that without official recognition, there's no legal basis for claiming Eli as Ethan. These documents are binding, Mr. Whitfield. Death certificates aren't easily overturned." Eli shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting between John and Officer Mitchell. The strain of the situation showed clearly on his young face. "I strongly advise against taking any further actions that might complicate this situation," Officer Mitchell concluded, rising from her chair. "We'll review the evidence you've presented, but please understand, the legal reality here is quite clear." The church sanctuary enveloped John in its peaceful silence as he sat alone in a corner pew. Stained glass windows filtered the evening light, casting muted colors across the wooden floor. The emptiness of the space seemed to mirror the hollow feeling in his chest after the day's difficult interrogation at the municipal building. Running his hands over his tired face, John struggled with the doubts that had been planted during Officer Mitchell's questioning. Maybe he was seeing what he wanted to see. Maybe grief had twisted his perception, making him chase shadows of hope where none existed. Sliding from the pew onto his knees, John bowed his head in prayer. His whispered words carried the weight of his uncertainty. "Lord, please, I need to know if I'm doing the right thing. Am I holding on to false hope? Or is this really my son?" As he prayed, memories of Ethan flooded his mind, teaching his son to cast a fishing line, watching him learn to swim, sharing quiet conversations under starlit skies. Each memory felt like a physical ache in his chest, both precious and painful. John's thoughts turned to Eli, to the familiar way he moved, the birthmark that matched perfectly, the natural instincts they shared during the dolphin rescue. But Officer Mitchell's words echoed in his mind. Grief can play tricks on our minds. Was that all this was? A trick of desperate longing? For a moment, John considered packing his bags and returning to Ohio. It would be easier, perhaps kinder to everyone involved. His pursuit might be causing Eli unnecessary distress, disrupting the life he'd built here. The rational part of his mind urged him to let go, to accept the official declaration of Ethan's death. Yet something deeper than reason, an instinct as natural as breathing, told him to stay. The journal entry Martha had found, the hospital records, the undeniable connection he felt, they couldn't all be coincidence. Even as doubt clouded his mind, his heart remained certain. Rising from his knees, John stood in the quiet sanctuary. Exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders, but beneath it lay a bedrock of determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles the legal system might present, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. The library's archival room stood silent in the late hours, save for the gentle rustle of papers and Martha's determined movements. The large wooden table before them disappeared beneath stacks of documents, old records, and carefully organized files. John's shoulders hunched with fatigue as he and Martha methodically worked through each piece of paper, their dedication unwavering despite the late hour. Martha's fingers moved with practiced precision through the files, her eyes scanning dates and names with remarkable focus. She occasionally paused to cross-reference information with John's account of Ethan's accident, creating a complex web of connections that grew more intricate with each passing hour. Returning to the journal entry they'd discovered earlier, Martha's expression suddenly shifted. "John," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. "I think I understand why this journal felt so significant." She pulled another stack of records closer, her movements more purposeful now. Minutes ticked by as Martha followed this new lead, her determination evident in every careful movement. Suddenly, her hand froze over a previously overlooked file. "Here," she breathed, carefully extracting an unfiled admission record. "Look at this." John leaned forward, his heart racing as he read the label. John Doe Teen. The date matched perfectly with Ethan's accident. His hands trembled as he scanned the detailed description of injuries, all consistent with a collision and near drowning. Martha quickly verified the record's authenticity, checking hospital stamps and signatures. "Everything aligns, John," she said softly. "The date, the injuries, even the location where he was found. This could be the proof we've been searching for." John's eyes welled with tears as he held the document, its significance overwhelming him. This wasn't just another piece of paper. It was the missing link that could officially connect Eli to Ethan. "We need to show this to Officer Mitchell," Martha said, already gathering their evidence into a neat pile. "With this record and the journal entries, We have enough to challenge Ethan's death declaration." As midnight approached, Martha carefully closed the record, looking up at John with bright eyes that reflected both relief and excitement. John clutched the precious document, his heart full of gratitude for Martha's unwavering support and determination. They had finally found what they needed, concrete evidence that could reunite father and son. The early morning sun cast long shadows through the bait shop's windows as Eli methodically prepared for the day ahead. The quiet was broken only by the soft sounds of his movements and the gentle hum of the bait tanks. John pushed open the door, the unfiled hospital record clutched firmly in his hand, his jaw set with determination. Old Sal stood behind the counter sorting through fishing supplies with practiced movements. He barely looked up as John approached, but his shoulders tensed visibly. "We need to talk," John said, his voice steady despite the emotion churning inside him. He placed the hospital record on the counter between them. "This proves everything. This is the missing piece that shows Eli is my son." Old Sal's hand stilled over the fishing lures. His eyes darted to the document but didn't touch it. "You're reading too much into old paperwork," he said gruffly, but his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. "I saw you that day," Old Sal admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "At the docks, you and your boy." He paused, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the counter. "But that doesn't mean—" "It means everything," John interrupted, pushing the record closer. "You rescued him, didn't you? You found him after the accident." Old Sal's face contorted with an inner struggle. "I pulled someone from the water that day," he said slowly. "A boy. But I can't be certain." "You've known all along," John pressed, his voice rising slightly. "Why keep this hidden? Why deny a father his son?" Old Sal's eyes flickered to Eli, who stood frozen near the bait tanks, watching the exchange with growing tension. "It's not that simple," Old Sal said, his voice heavy with regret. "There are things you don't understand, legal implications, consequences." "I don't care about legal implications," John insisted. "I care about my son." "You don't know what you're asking," Old Sal warned, his voice thick with emotion. "The truth? It could hurt more than help. Some things are better left—" "No," John cut in firmly. "No more hiding. No more half-truths. Eli deserves to know who he is. I deserve to know what happened to my son." Old Sal sagged against the counter, the weight of his secrets visible in every line of his face. "I was trying to protect him," he said softly. "Protect myself too, maybe. But you have to understand, revealing everything now, it could change everything and not in the ways you're hoping." The conversation reached a delicate pause. Old Sal fixed John with a somber look, years of unspoken pain reflected in his eyes. "Think carefully about what you're pushing for," he warned quietly. "Some truths come with prices none of us are ready to pay." The late morning sun filtered through the bait shop's dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. John stood firmly before Old Sal, the unfiled hospital record gripped tightly in his hand. Eli lingered near the bait tanks, his eyes darting between the two men as the tension thickened in the air. "Tell me everything," John said, his voice steady but firm. "No more half-truths." Old Sal's weathered hands trembled as he gripped the counter's edge. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, shoulders hunched under the weight of years of buried guilt. The few customers in the shop pretended to browse while stealing curious glances at the unfolding scene. After what seemed like an eternity, Old Sal's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Marcus was my nephew," he began, his words heavy with emotion. "We hadn't spoken in years. Family dispute turned ugly. He was just a boy, really, caught in the middle of adult problems." Old Sal's eyes welled with tears as he continued. "That day, Marcus had gone out on his boat too on the water. I saw the accident. I dove in without thinking. The water was chaos. Waves, debris everywhere." His voice cracked. "I thought I was saving Marcus. I was so sure it was him. But when I got him to shore—" He paused, drawing a shaky breath. "It was your boy, not Marcus. I'd saved the wrong one." The confession hung heavy in the air. John listened silently, his heart aching as understanding dawned on his face. Old Sal's protective behavior, his resistance to the truth. It all made terrible sense now. "I couldn't face it," Old Sal admitted, tears now flowing freely. "Couldn't admit that I'd failed Marcus. Taking care of your boy. It was my way of trying to make things right. But it was never enough. Never could be enough." John placed a gentle hand on Old Sal's trembling shoulder, both men bound by their shared connection to that tragic day. Eli stood motionless, watching as the truth of his past finally emerged from the shadows. The bait shop fell into profound silence, broken only by the soft hum of the tanks and Old Sal's quiet sobs. The silence in the bait shop hung thick as morning sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. John stood beside Old Sal, his hand resting gently on the older man's trembling shoulder. Eli remained near the bait tanks, his eyes wide as he processed the weight of Old Sal's confession. John drew a deep breath before speaking, his voice soft and understanding. "I can't imagine the burden you've carried all these years, Sal. Losing Marcus, and then having to live with that choice every day." Old Sal's weathered face crumpled as fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. "I'm so sorry, John. I should have told you sooner. I was so ashamed." "You saved my son's life," John said, squeezing Old Sal's shoulder. "Whatever mistakes were made that day, whatever guilt you've carried, I forgive you. Holding on to anger won't bring Marcus back, and it won't help any of us heal." Old Sal's body shook with quiet sobs as years of pent-up guilt finally found release. "I don't deserve your kindness." "We all deserve a chance to heal," John replied softly. Eli stepped forward then, his own eyes glistening. He wrapped his arms around Old Sal in a tight embrace. "Thank you for saving me," he whispered. "Thank you for taking care of me all this time." Old Sal hugged him back fiercely, years of protective love evident in his grip. When they separated, John extended his hand to Old Sal. "Let's move forward together," John offered. "There's room in Eli's life for both of us." Old Sal grasped John's hand, and the three men stood together as the morning light warmed the shop around them. The tense atmosphere that had filled the space moments before dissolved into something softer, gentler, a shared understanding born of tragedy and forgiveness. The municipal building buzzed with activity as John, Martha, and Old Sal gathered in the main conference room. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the stack of documents spread across the large oak table. Officer Karen Mitchell sat at the head, carefully reviewing each piece of evidence. "Let's begin with the unfiled hospital record," Officer Mitchell said, picking up the yellowed document. "This matches perfectly with the date of the boating accident." Martha stepped forward, pointing to specific entries. "The journal we discovered in the library archives corroborates these details. The descriptions of the injuries and the patient's physical characteristics align exactly with Ethan's." Old Sal cleared his throat, his voice steady but emotional. "I was there that day. I pulled him from the water myself. I thought he was my nephew Marcus, but it was Ethan." Officer Mitchell nodded, making careful notes as she cross-referenced the documents with official records. "The timing matches perfectly with the reported accident. And these medical details, they're consistent with the type of injuries we'd expect from such an incident." John watched anxiously as two other officials methodically examined each piece of evidence. His hand rested protectively on Eli's shoulder, who stood quietly beside him. "The birthmark," John added softly. "It's exactly where it's always been, just below his left shoulder blade." Officer Mitchell looked up from her papers. "Mr. Whitfield, could you share some specific memories, details that only a father would know?" John's voice grew stronger as he spoke about fishing trips, baseball games, and quiet moments shared between father and son. Eli's eyes glistened as fragments of these memories stirred within him. After several hours of thorough review, Officer Mitchell straightened the papers before her. Based on the evidence presented, the hospital records, the journal entries, old Sal's testimony, and the clear physical identifiers, we can confirm that Eli is indeed Ethan Whitfield. She pulled out an official document. We'll begin the process of reversing the death declaration immediately. All legal records will be updated to reflect Ethan's true status. Tears streamed down John's face as he pulled Eli into a tight embrace. The room fell silent, witnessing the powerful moment of reunion. Old Sal stood nearby, a weight visibly lifting from his shoulders as he watched father and son together. Officer Mitchell signed the final document with a flourish. "Congratulations, Mr. Whitfield. Your son is officially recognized as Ethan Whitfield, very much alive and now legally reunited with you." The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the beach as townspeople bustled about, preparing for the celebration. Colorful lanterns swayed in the gentle breeze while volunteers arranged tables with homemade treats and refreshments. The air buzzed with excitement and joy. John stood near the water's edge, watching the scene unfold with tears in his eyes. Eli helped string lanterns between wooden posts, occasionally catching his father's gaze and smiling. Martha directed the setup with cheerful efficiency, ensuring everything was perfect for this special occasion. As the gathering began, John stepped forward to address the crowd. His voice trembled with emotion as he spoke. 3 years ago, I lost hope, but this community, especially Martha, helped me find it again. Through faith and persistence, I've been blessed with a miracle, the return of my son. Martha followed, her eyes bright with unshed tears. When John first arrived here, he was searching for answers. Together, we discovered that faith and community can overcome even the deepest tragedies. This reunion proves that miracles still happen. Pastor Linda raised her hands in blessing. Dear Lord, we thank you for bringing Ethan back to his father. Bless this family as they begin their new journey together. Help us all remember that through you, all things are possible. Throughout the evening, townspeople approached John and Eli, sharing stories of how they'd witnessed their growing bond. Mrs. Thompson from the bakery recalled how she'd seen them walking together on the pier. Mr. Davis, the hardware store owner, remembered John's determination during the search for truth. Old Sal stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, accepting warm hugs and understanding smiles from neighbors. The weight of his secret had lifted, and he found himself embraced by the community's forgiveness and acceptance. The group gathered to light paper lanterns, each one representing hope and new beginnings. The soft glow illuminated faces filled with joy and wonder as the lanterns dotted the darkening sky. Laughter and conversation filled the air as people shared food and stories. Children played near the water's edge while adults gathered in small groups, celebrating the power of faith and perseverance. John and Eli walked hand in hand along the shoreline, soaking in the love and support that surrounded them. The golden sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues, creating a perfect backdrop for this joyous celebration. As father and son strolled together, their footprints marking the sand, they felt the full embrace of their community's love and support. Ending CTA. If you enjoyed the story of John and Ethan, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.